Hi, my name is Astrid Nyland. I work as an associate professor at the Museum of Archaeology, University of Stavanger on the southwest coast of Norway. My talk takes the Storegga tsunami, that is, a tsunami that battered the coast around the Norwegian Sea and the North Sea basin 8,200 years ago, as point of departure for learning about Mesolithic communities. My talk covers a few key themes. I will start by presenting the known physical impacts of the Storegga tsunami. I will then introduce a new research project called Life After the Storegga Tsunami, or LAST for short, running from 2021 to 2024. This project is in the process of exploring the social impacts of the coastal inhabitants' encounter with this potentially disastrous tsunami. Because of the COVID pandemic, we are somewhat delayed, but we do, however, have some initial hypotheses to share. The tsunami is often referred to as a disaster for the coastal population. But our project will dig deeper. We will try and specify what we mean by that, and how coping with crisis and natural hazards are potentially expressed in archaeological material. I will briefly outline the sources we intend to investigate, some methods we'll apply, and angles to explore. I should stress that others have investigated this earlier, but primarily this has been done through mining big data and proxies, often in the form of demographic modeling based on radiocarbon dates. Taking a slightly more anthropological and humanistic approach, we aim to study a wide range of sources indicating persisting knowledge transmission, but potentially also changing social practices. Our overall intention is to consider the hunter-gatherer fisher societies living in the Mesolithic. What constituted a disaster to a prehistoric coastal society? Should we presume that an encounter with a tsunami became a question of life or death, or are other impacts possible to infer? Which capacities did social hunter-gatherer fisher societies embed which may have allowed life to return to normal, if that was indeed what happened, or was intended? One may also ask whether there is an interpretive paradox in that one presumes societal decline caused by this tsunami and climate change, when we in all other aspects consider Mesolithic hunter-gatherer fishers as highly flexible and adaptive. A tsunami can be the result of a geological event that displaces water. In the case of the Storegga tsunami, there was a massive submarine landslide causing a trough in the sea outside the coast of Møre and following large travelling wave that battered the coast on both sides of the Norwegian Sea and North Sea basin. The model you see here indicates how the coast of especially Norway and Scotland were affected. It is only about 30–40 years since researchers like Alistair and Sue Dawson, Stein Bondevik and Jon Inge Svendsen, to name a few geologists, recognized this big prehistoric tsunami. Since then, a lot of work by both geologists and paleobotanists have traced its impact and dated the event more closely to sometimes during the autumn 8,200 years ago. Knowledge of the tsunami's date and range have been picked up by archaeologists and the popular media, and is generally referred to as a disaster for the coastal population. However, in which way did it turn out to be disastrous? And this has not really been specified beyond inferring a population decline based on a trough in demographic curve based on compiled radiocarbon dates. Our new research project, LAST, funded by the Norwegian Research Council, will investigate the social impacts of the Storegga tsunami based on material in the archaeological record. We will systematize what we know in order to identify patterns of either continuity or change in lithic technology, lithic raw material use, site location patterns, and other archaeological categories. So our main question is, how did this catastrophic or at least disruptive event affect the societal developments of the Mesolithic coastal communities? Can we, by highlighting persistence or shifting material patterns, build theories of Mesolithic societies' strengths and weaknesses, of capacities or vulnerabilities? We believe that anthropological and sociological disaster research will contribute greatly to our interpretive framework. So, to our project, an important premise is that we acknowledge that hazards can no longer be thought to have a purely natural ontology. Rather, the human and social now reside within them, as formulated by Roberto Barrios. We do not only ask what happened the day the sea became a monster, but we ask, did it become a monster? And how did people deal with that? So this project is perhaps really about the coastal community's relationship with the sea. And in the Norwegian Mesolithic, although also exploiting the inlands and mountain regions, people predominantly lived along the coast. The images on the bottom of this slide are screenshots from the Norwegian national database Askeladden. This is a database for all recorded sites in Norway, run by the Norwegian Directorate for Cultural Heritage Management. It is admittedly not showing only Stone Age sites or Mesolithic sites, but this is still very representative and illustrative of where Stone Age sites are located in the terrain on the Norwegian coast, from the early Mesolithic to the late Neolithic. After the last ice age, due to isostatic uplift, the land rose and sea sank. In some regions, though, both in Norway, Scotland, Dogland, and Denmark, the sea caught up with the land, causing a transgression. This is a challenge when investigating Mesolithic societies, since in some parts, sites are either still submerged or buried by beach deposits. Hence, our understanding of the number of sites at shores in specific time periods in the Mesolithic may be flawed. So much work has been put into establish and date the sea level curves in the different regions of Norway. Relating sites and sea level is a common method for relative dating in Stone Age archaeology in Norway. And sometimes this relative dating method is the only way to get an indication of age, as radiocarbon dating is not always available due to the lack of organic material or if typological elements are missing in the lithic material. Relating the location to the ancient reconstructed sea level gives us then an idea of when an area was free of water and ready for settling. As to how close to or far from the shore we reckon people lived is a matter of discussion, and often based on the typography or landscapes the sites are located in. Seeing the varying trajectories of the sea level along the Norwegian coast, this figure on the slide indicates that the histories of the sea may have changed between communities too. I therefore think it is vital to investigate social impact on local bottom-up analysis when trying to understand social developments. So the varying sea level, the large-scale tsunami hitting the coast in different heights and speed, and the 8.2 climatic cold event already making the weather wetter and wilder with storm surges and harsh winters, sets the scene of life with an unstable element, the sea. The sea represents both a stable resource but also risks and hazards. Regionally different histories were probably created, as in one area the sea level continuously sunk, whereas in another it steadily encroached land that had been known to generations past. How did people live with this? Did they feel a need to explain it? How were storms or tsunamis explained? Did they personify the storms? For example, in Norwegian folklore, we have numerous tales of the bad omen, the sea troll Draugen, who caught fishermen and drowned them at sea. In other coastal societies, one explains risks and hazards through stories too, like on Vancouver Island in Canada. Tsunamis were linked by the indigenous coastal population to supernatural beings, like the giant thunderbird or whale fighting or dancing. Acknowledging that the coastal population probably kept a vital oral tradition in the Mesolithic too may be exploited in our work with trying to identify any potential social impact of the tsunami. Knowledge transmission through storytelling and maintenance of social practices may have contributed to preserving strategies necessary for life to continue when disaster strikes. We are not at all certain that the tsunami was a disaster for the coastal population. Indeed, we do not think that we should per default define the Storegga tsunami as a disaster. For what is, or rather, what makes a disaster? A premise of ours is that a dramatic natural event becomes a disaster if the society does not have the capacities to survive and rebuild. This means that we will interpret the way the coastal societies handle the tsunami as indicators of political and social strategies or structures in the affected societies. Now, some may react to using the words political when talking about the Mesolithic. This is often preserved for discussing Neolithic society. But why is that? Why should we not acknowledge Mesolithic societies as capable of social planning and strategic institutionalized behavior? What does that say about what we expect of these societies? Were systems, institutions, or infrastructures lacking so negative impacts of the tsunami or the climate change were reinforced, or were such in place and enabled continuation? Moreover, we presume that yes, a disaster can be destructive, but it can also make room for change, and change is something that we archaeologists do like to look for in our material. So the physical impacts of a tsunami are well known through the identification of a recurring stratigraphic layer that geologists and botanists have found in their sediment cores in an area spanning from Greenland via Scotland, Doggerland to Norway. And we learn from recent tsunamis how they temporarily can cause chaos, can erode or bury intertidal shellfish beds, redeposit eroded materials, which may temporarily choke or deplete ecosystems. But what about the people experiencing this in the Mesolithic? Since the Storegga tsunami happened in the fall, people's winter storages may have been lost, resulting in starvation and hardship. In addition to overcoming and coping with practicalities, we must also assume that in some regions there was trauma and loss of lives. Hence, people had to cope with grief and fear too. So if people's ontological security were shaken, challenged or pressured, would this have triggered changes in social practices? And is this possible to detect archaeologically? One of the studies we will undertake in this project is a lithic study where we will compare lithic concepts in different demarcated areas or regions over time, and it is Dr. Hege Damlien who is leading this. We will be applying two methods. One is dynamic technological classification, the second is minimum analytical nodule analysis, or MANA. Both methods allow for predictions of on-site activities, as well as aspects of mobility, settlement systems, and land use. Very briefly explained, this first method will help us to distinguish the recipe or sequence of actions that a napper follows in order to achieve the desired end product. The second, MANA, is an attempt to reconstruct which stages of tool production are present or absent at a given site. The method thereby let us model the flow of lithic raw materials and tools into and from a site. In this approach lies another premise that lithic technology and raw materials express social networks, affinity, and group identity. The social and physical context of when, where, and with whom an artifact is made and used sets the scene for the transmission, maintenance, or transformation of cultural information. We hope comparative studies can enable us to infer knowledge transmission of technological traditions within and between groups. Perhaps will contemporary gaps in knowledge transmission emerge, or we may find reorientations in social networks expressed in the material culture that we have recovered. So, any identified patterns in technology or communities of practice can be interpreted as institutionalized social strategies facilitating knowledge transmission. And in my opinion, this kind of shared knowledge and practice is thus an important element for survival and must be considered a vital capacity of a society. It is interesting that the tsunami has been identified in wetlands and lakes surrounding sites, but not often on archaeological sites themselves. Yet how can we be sure about what to expect and look for? In the Holocene at the Kuril Island in Japan, the only impact archaeologists and anthropologists could detect after numerous tsunamis was a tendency for people to move to higher ground. The PhD candidate on the project, Håvard Kilhamn, will undertake a location analysis considering local mobility or preferences in location or settlement practices. This may have been a strategic adaptation to risks or hazards. He will compile information on sites and their location, discuss the method of sea level dating, and implement knowledge about the tsunami impact on his compiled sites, using a numeric simulation model of the Storegga tsunami as a tool. This model will be made by the Norwegian Geotechnical Institute for selected areas in West Norway. The postdoc on the project, Dr. James Walker, will work with systematizing and evaluating the environmental data we know and have from earlier studies of the time period in question along the coastlines. We find that we need to know the methods and materials which have been used earlier to identify the wave and impacts, and then consider whether this is what we need to learn more about the tsunami impact. Walker will also work with a numeric simulation model and will be part of potentially testing the presumed impact in selected areas where we know there are Mesolithic sites. In relation to this, some fieldwork may be undertaken, but the details of this is not yet decided. If no gap or change can be found in lithic technology, raw material exploitation, settlement, or mobility practices, that could be a testimony to the resilience of the societies. People were leaning on the institutional power of craft, traditions, social practices, or traditions through crisis. Considering what makes social ties and social networks strong enough for a technology or tradition to survive is, in my opinion, a way into the root causes of social stability. However, we might also find that things changed after the tsunami in some regions. We then need to discuss whether this is a sign of a differently organized society or group with other strategies or a case of different impacts. There are several concepts such as resilience, mobility as adaptation, cultural transmission that we consider important. But we also acknowledge the importance of storying or worlding in Donna Haraway's terms. How do humans maintain ontological security? How do societies remember? We will consider various practices in the Mesolithic, but also epistemological consequences in archaeological interpretive work related to how we choose to investigate and which stories we believe our materials is suited to tell. So to finish off, the tsunami is a known dramatic event that we will use as a point of departure to learn more about aspects that really were a matter of life and death in Mesolithic societies. How did people organize, live, and take back control after a dramatic encounter with the omnipresent sea? We know the tsunami happened. We know it might have been potentially disastrous for part of the coastal communities. But what happened next? Is it possible for us to know? By investigating and considering tendencies and patterns in the archaeological material, it is not our intention to try and pin all change on the tsunami. But we will pivot around it. We will use it as a point in time that potentially could shift or have the power to disrupt the historical contingency. We will use that to explore the archaeological material with the hope of learning how people lived in its aftermath. It's a point of departure to learn more about capacities and vulnerabilities, life and death in Mesolithic societies. So thank you for your attention, and here are the other members of the project and their home institutions, and a big thank you to the Research Council of Norway that funds this project. And to end, here are references to the citations and some of the figures that I've used in this talk. Thank you again.